Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay, even in the back? Perfect. Good afternoon, I'm Dr. James Herrera Brooks, Melanie Trent DeShutter Library Director here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture in our Scholar Series. We wish to acknowledge the generosity of former trustee Anne Worrell, who endowed this lecture series in honor of our former president and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan. Before we begin with today's program, I just want to make you aware of a couple of events that are upcoming here at the museum. So on July 4th, we're going to be hosting a naturalization ceremony in partnership with the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So come along to celebrate America's newest citizens with cake, lemonade, and live music. And afterwards, after you've washed your hands, please come to the library for a special display of collection treasures that relate to the nation's founding and the ways in which Virginians have celebrated and marked July 4th for nearly 250 years. And in terms of our lecture series, our next lecture will actually be our 2024 Hazel and Fulton Chauncey lecture, for which we will be welcoming best-selling author and award-winning military historian Patrick O'Donnell for a talk entitled The Unvanquished, The Untold Story of Lincoln's Special Forces, the Manhunt for Mosby's Rangers, and the Shadow War that forged America's Special Operations. I hope to see you there. Before we move on to today's lecture, I just want to ask you to all just take a moment to check your mobile phones to make sure they're set to silent, do not disturb, or otherwise switched off. And with that, I'll begin introducing. Conventional wisdom locates apples and cider firmly in regions outside of the South. But apples and cider transform the region, and Southern apples are now spread and enjoyed across the globe. Southerners have cultivated over 2,000 apple varieties from Virginia to Mississippi, ranging from northern varieties that flourish on southern soil to local varieties grown by a single family in one particular county. Apples were entwined with slavery and the taking of indigenous land, and have ultimately been central to Southern foodways for more than 200 years. But in less than the lifetime of a tree, Southerners lost their rich apple culture, but there is a tentatively hopeful future ahead. Here today to provide a definitive story of apples in the South is Diane Flynt. Diane founded Foggy Ridge Cider in 1997 in Carroll County, Virginia, after a long career in corporate finance. Her cider apples, cultivated in the Foggy Ridge orchards in the Blue Ridge Mountains, are sold to cider makers across the South. And alongside her history of the apple in the South and in Southern foodways, Diane will trace the arc of her own journey as a pioneer. So please join me in welcoming Diane Flynt.
Thanks for that warm introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in a room full of curious people. You're all readers. You're all interested in the world around you. And in that, you share something with early Southerners. They were what I call, they and you are what I like to call noticers. You take notice of the world around you. You're interested in what's happening around you and perhaps also your interior world. And for early Southerners, being noticers, that was a matter of survival. But for you, I bet it's a quality that enriches your life. So thanks for being here today and wanting to learn more. And I've just got to pause. I just came down from upstairs for a quick walk through the Julia Child exhibit and talk about what a force, a pioneering woman who created a space and occupied it with her big personality and her great talent. So take a minute and notice what this museum has done with this really interesting, educational, but really fun exhibit. There's some hilarious pictures you're going to enjoy. I like to always begin any talk I give with place. And for me, museums like this one, archives, libraries, and even bookstores are sacred places. This museum, like library is the Hawks Children's Library from my hometown of West Point, Georgia. And my sister Suzanne is down here, also from West Point, of course, and she probably remembers this too. But today, the smell of linseed oil will immediately transport me back to this building. And I spent my childhood sitting on that oil-slicked floor, reading every single book at least once. And that sparked a line of desire for me, a desire for deep inquiry and curiosity and an interest in the world around me. And that led me to plant apples and found a cidery, and it led me to research and write this book, and it led me to you here today. So I hope I can share some of that. Museums are part of this line of inquiry, and this one has done a beautiful job of presenting our past as a complex and nuanced story. And I hope my words about the Southern apple story today will give you just a glimpse into how complex and intertwined our own histories are, and how important it is to understand that complexity. My place in the world is the Southern Appalachians. I live in Douglasburg, Virginia, which is even past Blacksburg. We're in Rova. Do y'all know what Rova stands for? Rest of Virginia. And we're up on the Blue Ridge Plateau at 3,000 feet elevation. The important number for you regarding our location is 13, because we are reliably 13 degrees cooler than Richmond all year long, which means we are a great place to grow apples. This is a view from our farm, and you see in this part of the world, you see apples everywhere. This is an old winesap tree leaning over a barn near our farm in Floyd and Carroll counties. And about 2 months ago, it just exploded into bloom. And you all associate apples with the mountain South, I bet. The Appalachians that range from Virginia down to northern Mississippi. And you see apples everywhere in my region. You see them on the side of the road on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And I like pictures like this out of my moving car, where you see an old apple tree, a treasured family tree that's protected from cattle by fence, and it's probably, that one's probably 80 years old. But what you don't know, you know apples reside in the mountain South with me, but what you don't know is that once apples grew all over the South. Apples grew in Mississippi and Louisiana. Mobile, Alabama exported apples to northern states for 80 years. One of the most important southern nurseries in the 19th century was in Pomaria, South Carolina, outside Columbia. And they sold hundreds of apple varieties. Tidewater, Virginia exported apples, early season apples like Yellow Transparent and Maiden Blush, to northern states after the Civil War. Coastal North Carolina, a famous old southern apple called Matamesquite that was thought to be lost, named after the Matamesquite Indigenous tribe, was rediscovered about 10 years ago, 60 yards from the Atlantic Ocean. So places like Pomaria and small farms, large farms, grew a variety of apples, a cornucopia. And here with Bandit, there for size reference, you'll see that on your right, the little tiny Hughes crab apple, a wonderful cider apple, grown now by many cideries in Virginia and all over the country, really, all the way over to the big horse apple on your left. The horse apple was so common in the South that you couldn't find it in a nursery catalog because everybody already had one in their backyard. So you see, the South had apples everywhere. And apples connected me, and that's interesting. Okay, that's what apples are. Okay, but why spend 2.5 years researching and writing about apples? I was interested in not just what they are, but why they are. And the reason that's important has to do with apple sex. So I need to take a moment and explain apple reproduction to you, because that explains how apples and people are connected. So I'll just take you quickly through the apple buds and the bloom with the little pollinator, and then you got petal fall, and then you have the little apple. And apples reproduce heterozygously, which is the way humans do. It's sexual reproduction. So the seeds that are inside that tiny apple, you know, the offspring of the apple isn't the apple, that's the womb. The seed is the offspring, and each seed is the combination of the DNA of two parents. So inside that little apple, as it matures, will be about 8 seeds, and those 8 seeds will be brand new to the world. And apples have something kind of one up on humans in that they're what's called extremely heterozygous. So if you took a Honeycrisp, which is probably your favorite apple, and you planted the 8 seeds that are in it, you would get 8 new apples to the world, just like if you had 8 children, brand new to the world. But they wouldn't look anything like a Honeycrisp. They might be little and brown or big and red. They probably wouldn't taste very good. They'd probably be bitter and sharp. So you see immediately that the way apples reproduce is immense genetic variation. That's one reason apples are the most, have the greatest geographic diversity of any fruit. They grow from upstate, upcountry Canada into Africa, into mountainous regions of Africa, even in North America, into North Florida. The Panhandle originated one apple. So you're thinking, well, how do we get all those piles of Honeycrisp? Well, that's where humans come in, and that's the connection I wanted to talk about. That's grafting, that's replication. I talked about reproduction. The way you get the same apple is through replication, and humans have known how to graft for 2,000 years. So imagine Thomas Grimes in the early 1800s in West Virginia, and he saw this big, beautiful apple tree growing out of a trash heap on his farm. This is a true story. And he thought that apple was desirable. It was big and delicious, and it ripened in September, and it kept for a while. It actually made really good cider. And he named it after himself. He named it Grimes Golden, and he reproduced it. And it became one of the most popular apples in the South and a parent of Golden Delicious. He put his desire on that fruit. So every Southerner who saw an apple that they desired and wanted to reproduce it, and this is not just the aristocratic apple growers, every Southerner, black, white, and indigenous, when they chose an apple, they put their desire on that fruit, and that creates a history and a culture for all the 2,000 apple varieties that were grown in the South. Each one of them has a story. And so my book, although it has a beautiful picture of Rawls Janet on the cover, an old Virginia apple from the 1700s, it's not really about apples. It's about the people, the places, the events, the culture, and the history that apples hold. So I'm going to share a few stories with you. This is very story focused. And I'll start with Virginia. I wanted to focus this talk on Virginia, and I'll start by talking about a man named William Fitzhugh. And if you ask Dr. Google, what's the first orchard in America, Dr. Google will say it's Reverend Blackstone Orchard in Boston, Massachusetts. But 10 years before that, we had orchards in Virginia, a lot of them in Jamestown, Thomas Gates, at Littleton, at Green Spring, not just the big plantations, but small farms everywhere. And we know a lot about William Fitzhugh's orchards because he documented them. And in 1670, he was the youngest son of a wool merchant, and he immigrated to the Northern Neck. There were a bunch of people from his hometown in England, and he landed there. He had some legal training, and he brought, he had 2 indentured servants with him. He set up a legal practice, and he planted orchards. And we, that sounds easy. He planted orchards. Of course, he didn't plant the orchards. And Virginia was blanketed with virgin forests. So to plant anything, tobacco or apples or anything, you had to cut down trees, cypress trees, 18 feet in diameter, huge chinkapin and oak and hickory. They were sawed with mattocks. There were no chainsaws. And the stumps were burned, sort of. And then the apples and the tobacco and other crops were planted all in and among those trees. Fitzhugh's was one of the first orchards that was fenced, and he bragged about his his 9-foot-tall locust fence that was as durable as a brick wall. And let me tell you, I'll read you a little bit from my book about William Fitzhugh. And it's, I think, a good example to begin with because it shows how apples are entwined with so many things about the South. William Fitzhugh pursued land and status and found the path to both when on May 1st, 1674, with fruit trees blooming across the South, 23-year-old William Fitzhugh married 11-year-old Sarah Tucker, the daughter of Rose Tucker, a legal client. Through this fortuitous marriage, he gained connections to the most prominent Virginia and Maryland families. He received a wedding gift from Rose Tucker of an enslaved man and woman. 2 years later, Fitzhugh was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. Sarah, who moved to England after the wedding to complete her education, gave birth 4 years later at age 15 to the first of 6 children. Powered by servants, the labor of enslaved people, inherited wealth, and an advantageous marriage, Fitzhugh launched a Virginia dynasty, and he also planted apple orchards. You know, we know about Fitzhugh because he wrote a lot of letters. I read 300 of them. It's mostly about legal matters. But we know that because he had the education and the privilege and the status to write those letters and to have them preserved over time. So he tells us a tiny bit of the story, a story that's entwined with things we're all aware of. But it is what is seen. And in this book, I tried to also get at the history that is unseen. So by the 1750s, Southerners had given up on English apples and were growing Southern varieties, all chosen by Southerners. Virginia nurseries, a William Smith nursery in Surry County. There was a nursery in Williamsburg. And each of these apples on these lists, and there were hundreds of apples on each one, each of them carried, they had a person who came with those apples. One of the nurseries that I'd like to know more about, and I talk about a little bit in my book, there's more to know, is the Franklin Davis's Richmond nurseries. And he says, the catalog reads, you can't read it, it's on 124 acres on the Brook Turnpike, 1.5 miles from the city. That was the first toll road, with soil that was a perfect combination of sand and loam. So in 1860, note that date, 1860, year before the Civil War, he went to a meeting of the American Pomological Society, the apple greats of America, who were all up in the Hudson River Valley in New Jersey. And he brought 75 Southern apples. He won a silver medal. And and that was at a time when Northerners and the pomology greats of the country didn't recognize Southern apples. Books were written around that time that mentioned, would have 300 apples and 4 Southern apples, 200 apples and 1 Southern apple. And here he's trotting up from Richmond with 75 apples and gets a silver medal. His, unlike Pomaria Nursery I mentioned earlier, Franklin Davis's nursery did survive the Civil War. And in 1869, in this catalog with this charming engraving, he offered, these are all Southern apples, 18 summer apples, 19 autumn apples, 53 winter apples, plus an additional 360. I'm just going to read you something that struck me from his catalog in a way that he believed that apples offered a way forward. And he wrote, a change has taken place in the labor system of the Southern states, and with it comes a change in the pursuits of her people. Many are looking and are undecided as to what they shall undertake. We believe that fruit growing offers greater inducements than anything else. He was a real booster for apples in an economy that could no longer support tobacco. So at this time, apples were entwined with Southern life, and I've talked about aristocrats. Let me show you some images from museums like this. I visited or corresponded with over 50 archival collections, universities, county historic societies, and each one was full of stories, local stories of orchards in that area. Southerners dried apples on roofs. This is an image from the Shenandoah from Kentucky. You see drying apples on sheets of metal tin. Whole families worked in pack houses and were housed in barracks. And when apples were loaded into wooden barrels, one of the stories in my book from North Carolina in Cataloochee in Haywood County, loaded apples in wooden barrels, put them on horse-drawn wagons, and drove them. It took a day and a half to get to Knoxville in Columbia, South Carolina, with Southern apples that were sold in those markets. Apples went on barges down the Mississippi. Here's an image from Jackson, Mississippi, of apples being sold that were taken probably from West Virginia down to Mississippi. And here back to Virginia is Afton Mountain. This is the depot. When the railroads came, we shipped apples to northern states, to Chicago. And I think someone mentioned in my introduction about Southern apples being global. This is an image of the Albemarle pippin, which you all, I'm sure, have read about, being in Richmond and was exported to England for many years and beloved by Queen Victoria. So I've talked about Virginia. I want to go back to my home state and share an interesting story about that's, again, a confluence of many factors of our Southern history. This gentleman with a 4-barrel name, Jules Prosper Alphonse Berkmans, a 12th generation Belgian aristocrat, immigrated to Georgia. Why not? And he founded Fruitlands Nursery outside Augusta, Georgia. He was very skilled. He was a young man in his 20s. He came with his father, but already had a big education in fruit growing. And he was a noticer. I found his journals. This is a little pocket, probably 6 by 4 inch pocket notebook at the University of Georgia Archives. And he kept meticulous notes. He recorded and drew pictures, and he was a noticer, and he put Southern apples on the stage because he had the stature, the personality, the survival. His nursery was outside Sherman's march to Georgia, so it did survive the Civil War, and actually it persisted into the 20th century. And it was a famous old, it was a concrete house that had apple storage in the basement and big veranda all around. And you've seen this house. You see this house every spring. Does anybody recognize this house? This is now the clubhouse of the Augusta National Golf Course. And Fruitlands Nursery, the golf course is on the grounds of Fruitlands Nursery. And his sons were actually the ones who came up with the idea of planting a different tree at every hole. But it is absent any edible fruit, I have to tell you. So that's a great story about Georgia. But what else is there? I think knowing about this aristocratic Belgium, it doesn't tell the full story, because before Prosper Berkmans, indigenous people in Georgia were growing apples. Apples are not native to North America. There are 4 species of native crab apples, the little green ones you threw at your cousin when you were little. But Malus domestica is not native to North America. It came to North America probably not in Jamestown, probably in the 1500s through Maine and cod fishermen, or perhaps about the same time from Florida with the Portuguese and the Spanish. That's when citrus came. It spread, we've talked about the genetic diversity, spread with animals, and indigenous people were growing apples long before colonizers arrived. And Georgia had, we're now in the early 1800s. The Georgia Cherokee and Creek had great orchards. Here's a map, and all those little dots represent orchards in Cherokee, Georgia. And this great apple experiment came to an end in 1836 with the passage of the Indian Removal Act. And at that time, Georgia had the largest population of indigenous people. And we remember that violent expulsion with the 2 paragraphs we got in Georgia history on the Trail of Tears. There's a wonderful book written by Claudio Sant, professor at the University of Georgia, called Unworthy Republic, that covers that period of history and is won all kinds of book awards. It's a wonderful book and well worth a read. And I could delve more into that. The Cherokee were excellent farmers. They cultivated or used over 200 species of plants in their diet, in their culture, and for medicine. And they had great orchards. And the reason we have this map is that after Indian removal, after the Cherokee were removed in just a series of less than 2 weeks, federal valuators came into Cherokee territory and valued their possessions because they were to be given or auctioned to white Georgians. They counted the number of pots and pans, the looms, the wagons, the horses, and the cattle, and they counted the orchards and the trees. So we know that over half of Cherokee households had mature orchards. The small ones were 30 to 50 trees. Major Ridge, the largest Cherokee landowner, had 500 apple trees in his orchard. And these were not the 18-foot, 20-foot semi-dwarf trees that I grow. These were trees grown on their own roots. These were 60 feet tall. These were big as maple trees. That's what an apple tree grows to without dwarfing. So the story gets even more interesting because for several years after Indian removal, a Georgia nurseryman, Jarvis Van Buren, traveled into Cherokee territory and gathered grafting wood, gathered apples, and the apples he liked. He came back in the winter and got grafting wood, and he owned a nursery called Gloaming Nursery, and he introduced those apples to the trade, to the nursery trade. He painted pictures of them. He was an engineer, an architect, a lot of other things, but he was also a great promoter of apples. So today we have apples like Kitagiski. This is an apple that Jarvis Van Buren brought into the nursery trade. We can taste this apple. We know what it is. We know what Junaluska is and Kulisaga and Kitagiski, but we don't know why they are. We don't know the history that the Cherokee attached to this fruit. We don't know their names. So that's the unseen part of the Georgia apple story. Before I talk more about apples, I want to talk about desire. I talked about apples being a receptacle for the desire of humans, and in that they carry stories. And I talked about the children's, Hawk's Children's Library. I like to use the term line of desire. That's a landscape architecture term that refers to the shortest distance, the most direct route between where you are and where you want to go. And you could see this over at VCU right now because the students walk where they want to go, and it is not on the sidewalk, and they're passed all through the grass, and those are called lines of desire. But I think of lines of desire as having a bigger meaning. And for me, the Hawk's Children's Library represents a line of desire, and it's that tug, that thing that tugs at you your whole life, that inclination, that pull that you come back to decades after decades. It could be an intellectual pursuit or a place or a community or a value. It just won't let go of you. It is something that is deep in you. And that library represents for me the deep curiosity that I have and a deep desire for inquiry that animated me from 8 years old on. This image here, this view of a long mown path out to a big old oak tree is the view from our house in Southwest Virginia. And this represents for me a second animating desire in my life, which is a deep connection to the natural world. And in researching and writing this book, I was able to bring those two lines of desire together, inquiry and the natural world. And I bring that up and I give you that term, as a gift, because you each have your own lines of desire. And I encourage you to to dig into them and explore them and don't let them go. It doesn't matter. They're not going to let you go anyway. So you might as well explore them. James mentioned that my book also includes a little bit of my own story. Each chapter starts with a piece from my history in founding a cidery and making cider. And this is a story that's another illustration of my connection to the natural world. And this is about a trip I made with my mom and a friend of hers to Lake Burton, Georgia, when I was probably about 8 or 10 years old. The first thing I noticed was the breeze on my skin. The light, and Lake Burton is in North Georgia. It's in the Appalachians. The light wind off the lake felt foreign. It was a cool breeze, not the sticky, moist air that hung heavy in my hometown a few hours south. I sat on the dock, my legs in the blue-green water, so clear I could see my toes. Though I had traveled only 200 miles northeast, I felt transported to another world. All my life I'd played in red clay creeks, but had never walked beside a rushing stream filled with smooth, tumbled stones. On my first visit to the southern mountains, I ate wild asparagus and saw trillium. I paddled a canoe on a cold mountain lake rimmed with maples and oaks. I believe all of us carry inside us a landscape that is fundamental to who we are. Landscape is another form of language, a way of communicating. And at some point, we find the one that fits our story best. That weekend, it was love at first sight for me in the Appalachians. I found my new language, one that felt as familiar to me as my own Georgia drawl. That summer, I discovered my landscape, the land I carried in my heart. It took me decades to find my way back. I think I have time for one more story, another Virginia story from Rova. It's about the Rock Castle community, and this takes me to cider. I want to mention Annette Boyd is here from the Virginia Wine Marketing Office. She is hugely responsible for bringing the beautiful Virginia wine the grapes that we grow and the beautiful wine that's made in Virginia. She's responsible for bringing that to public attention. If you have any questions about Virginia wine, grab that lady right there before you leave. She knows it all. But in Rock Castle Gorge today, it's a steep, it goes from 3,200 feet to 1,700 feet, kind of straight down. And it today is a hiking trail. I've often hiked there. It's all wooded right now. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was full of apple trees. Patrick County in 1901 had 375,000 apple trees. And these were full-size trees. These are not dwarf trees. Patrick County was the center of apple production. And much of it went into distilleries, legal distilleries. I mean, Rock Castle is just about 8 miles long. And it had, I've got to check this because there's so many. It had 6 legal distilleries in Rock Castle on 6 miles. But most of the apples went down to the DeHart distillery in Stewart. And they were called Stillhouse apples. And they powered a community. There were 2 stores and 2 churches and, a vibrant life in this little community. You visit the area and you think, how did anybody ever live here? So this is what happened. So my book, The Wild, Tame, Lost, Revived, I'm talking now about one of the ways that we lost in less than 50 years, lost many of those 2,000 apple varieties. I explore, the simple answer is modernity. I explore several aspects, and here's one of them. Rock Castle residents were proud of their Stillhouse apples. These apples ripened early, and like most summer apples, they didn't store well. There were 6 legal distilleries in Rock Castle, but most of the apples headed to DeHart's. Where we are, they call it DeHart's. Matt Connor's 25 or 30 acre orchard on a southeast slope alongside Rock Castle Creek was one of the largest orchards in the community. His prosperous orchards helped build a 2-story frame house that still stands today. In 1914, Virginia held a vote on state prohibition. Patrick County residents voted 471 for and 1,055 against. but the statewide vote passed by 60%. When Prohibition went into effect in 1916, DeHart Distillery closed, and this dealt a death blow to the Rockcastle economy and those decades-old orchards. In March 1932, a strong winter storm pounded Southwest Virginia. Ice and sleet fell for 2 days in near zero temperatures, followed by heavy snow that brought down telephone lines and power lines. The storm severely damaged Matt Connor's orchard. His descendants believe the storm and the loss of his trees led to his death. He contracted pneumonia and died 2 weeks after the storm. The same year, his son, Wyatt Connor, left his family home in Rockcastle to work in a textile mill near Burlington, North Carolina. And that off-farm migration, modernity, and all the forces came with it were part of how we lost our apples. So one more little story, and we'll take some questions. Got a picture of the DeHart Distillery. I believe I talked about you being a curious community of noticers. My hunch is you're also creative, like the woman upstairs who created a whole category in a world of food that now many people inhabit, including the great chefs here in Richmond. A big part of what drove me to found Foggy Ridge Cider was this desire to create and to make. And this little glimpse is an image from the night before the first pressing, the first commercial pressing of apples at Foggy Ridge Cider, which would have been in 2001. One September night, just before our first pressing, I drove up to our house to grab sandwiches to fuel our last hour of work. From our steep driveway, I could see the long, low cider house tucked below Tony Goad's cow pasture, lights blazing and a tractor idling by the loading dock. A tiny crescent moon rose in the deep purple sky above the orchard. Steam poured off the back of the crush pad from the pressure washer and billowed in white clouds off the tail of my little building. I got out of the truck and stood under the stars, feeling as if I was at the top of a swing. That moment when you rise to the top of the arc and you are for just a second breathless. My cider house looked like a ship on a green sea, powered by steam-colored rolling waves. Despite all the paradoxes that plagued me in this urgent moment, I felt at peace. Work was both numbingly difficult and full of joy. I was inexperienced and I was insightful. I was afraid and I was courageous. I was ready to sail my little ship. So some of the stories we have about apples lie close at hand. We can hold them. Some are more obscured and are worthy of deep dives and using your curiosity to go for them. I encourage you to use your curiosity in your own lives. And I think we've got time for a few questions here if you'd like me to satisfy your curiosity about some apple questions. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, are there any of those original apple trees that are in the wild? I mean, or have they just all disappeared?
So wild apples would be wild. They would not be named. They would be seedling apples. And seedling apples can live a long time. Where I live and in North Georgia and places I visited, you often see seedling apples growing in fence rows where they haven't been, eaten by cows or run over by bush hogs. You'll see them in odd places on old farms, like not near the house where someone might have planted a tree, but off somewhere. The picture I showed earlier of the apple tree on the Blue Ridge Parkway, that was a wild tree. And they can live a long time. And they produce. I discovered a wonderful discovery this year after finishing my book. I had done some research at Guilford College, a Quaker college in North Carolina. The Quaker community, there's a deep history of Quakers and apples, and a fascinating story in my book about Henderson Llewellyn taking Southern apples on the Oregon Trail, blah, blah, blah. But I got to know some folks at Guilford College, and I got a call saying, "Did you know we have an old apple tree on campus?" And it turns out the Guilford College campus, which is from the mid 1800s, was originally a farm, and they had an orchard, and there is an old tree there, a very old tree. And it's right in the middle of campus now. It's right on a corner with sidewalks going right beside it. And it's big and has a canopy. It's all dead in the middle. And they were concerned about how to care for it. And I took one look at it and called Dr. Greg Peck, who's in the pomology department at Cornell, and said, what should we do here? And call Virginia Tech. And we ended up finding a solution. And I also gathered leaves last summer and sent them off for DNA testing. The DNA testing for apple varieties, the price has come down enough so that homeowners could spend $50 to have your unknown tree tested. And it turns out they have a mammoth black twig, which is an old southern apple widely grown in North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia even. And we think that tree is over 100 years old. They're trying to find the records, but it's a giant. It'll be there for a while. I also got grafting wood. I grafted it and sent it to 2 nurserymen, so that tree still lives. And I'm working with the president of Guilford College. They're going to plant that tree out in their nursery and give it to some of their donors as a gift, as the Guilford College tree.
Before you started your talk, which was just really fascinating, when I think of apples, one of the things I think about is Johnny Appleseed. Can you tell me did he have anything to do with Southern apples, or where was he? All I know is he existed, as far as I know.
He did, and it's Ohio Valley. And Michael Pollan's book, Botany of Desire, if you check that out from the library, it's worth buying. It's a wonderful book. He devotes a whole chapter to John Chapman, which is Johnny Appleseed's name. And I think Michael Pollan does an excellent job of demystifying John Chapman, who was quite a character. He did not believe in grafting. He was a Swedenborgian. He believed that, only God could make things, and grafting was, taking life in human hands. And he spread seedling apple trees all over the Ohio River Valley. But he really was sort of a real estate schemer, because one way you could claim land was to plant apple trees. So the mythology has grown up around him as this sort of barefoot, quirky guy, and he was a quirky guy. But he had some other things going on too. So it's a fascinating story, and dig deeper, but not a Southern connection.
Yes. What I'm curious about, when you talk about the variety of apples that we have, who makes the determination what apples actually make it to the super counter market, since we have a variety of about 5 choices?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and I think the industry might say, oh, consumers make the choice. What you want, you get. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. I write about visiting Glaze Orchard over in Winchester, a wonderful 5th generation now orchard, cider makers, David Glaze, Old Town Cidery. And I was standing there with Phil Glaze at the pack line, where the apples come in and they get separated into all different levels, and some go to Walmart and some go to Kroger and some go to the feedlot. And they were sorting Rome that day, Rome apples, and he pulled one off, and it was a perfect red apple. And it was slightly lopsided. And he said, Walmart won't buy this because it doesn't stack in the box. And the boxes are going to stack on each other. And the side that's lopsided gets bruised. And it shows up in the store. It has a flaw. And then consumers don't want it. So it has to ship well. It has to be picked green. It has to be able to be stored for a year in a carbon dioxide environment and sprayed with Stay Fresh, and has to survive our global supply chain, because apples are a global commodity. And you're seeing New Zealand apples now, apples from Chile, apple juice. 90% of the apple juice concentrate in the world is made in China. So it's complicated. It's complicated. Now, the other piece of that is that universities have two universities, Cornell, well, three really, Washington State, University of Michigan, and Cornell have excellent breeding programs. Virginia has a research station that does a little bit of breeding. Actually, it's in West Virginia, but works with Virginia. But those three universities, they want to breed apples that are called club apples. And what that means is they come up with an apple based on consumer testing and focus groups and all kinds of panels, getting people like you in a room and asking what you like. And then they spend years breeding. And when they get an apple, they patent it, and they allow only growers from their state to sell that apple. And those growers have to pay a lot of money to sell that apple. When Honeycrisp first came out, only 20 growers could grow it in Washington State. The patent has expired for Honeycrisp in this country. It still exists in Europe. But the university made millions of dollars on that patent for Honeycrisp. Cosmic Crisp is the new apple. And the next question is going to be, why is everything named Crisp now? So I get to talk about my favorite subject, Honeycrisp, the evil Honeycrisp. So there's a term when you read about sensory evaluation of apples, there's a term called breaking flesh. And I got to get a little scientific here. So the flavor in an apple is enclosed in the cell walls and vacuoles, which are little bundles of fluid. And that's where all the flavor is in an apple. And when you bite into an apple, your teeth crush those cell walls. An apple is 25% air. So when you bite into the apple, it's like this bicycle pump just pumps that juice into your mouth. So the apple is sort of an ideal flavor vehicle for putting flavor in your mouth, because it pushes that juice in your mouth, goes up into your top palate where you have a lot of sensory receptors, aroma to your nose, and then to your sensory receptors all over your mouth. So a breaking flesh is the kind of cell wall that Honeycrisp has. So the cell walls in a Honeycrisp, rather than crushing, they break. And that's why you get that big crunch and that big mouthful of juice with a Honeycrisp. And when Honeycrisps came on the market, people just loved that. They just went, I mean, how many people here, Honeycrisp is your favorite apple? Well, I like that. Not too many. Usually it's like 3/4 of the audience. It's like, I can't buy them. They're not at the store. And it is a great, breaking flesh does, put that flavor for you. But now everybody wants that genetic variant that creates the breaking flesh. So all the breeding now is for very, very crisp apples, which for me are almost too hard. It's like I have good orthodontia. I don't want to damage my expensive teeth, and they hurt my gums. And, I just am not a fan of that breaking flesh. And then while I'm dissing Honeycrisp, it's a bit one note. And that's another thing you see in these modern apples. Although I think the Cosmic Crisp, and I can't remember the name of the one from Cornell, we can't get it down here. I got to taste it when I was up there. It has crisp in the name. They're a little more complex. I think the breeding is giving us a little more tartness and a little more complexity, which is a nice thing. Speaking of Julia Child and apples, rumor has it that her favorite apple was Ida Red. I have no way of knowing if that was true. It's been reported a lot by Dr. Google, but you know how accurate that is. Ida Red is it grows in the South, not widely grown. It's a very nice apple. It's tart, sweet, and it's a good cider apple. It has a lot of acidity. Yeah. Other questions? Got a couple more minutes. Miss Suzanne?
There were a lot of varieties brought into the South by salesmen and things like that, and there was not much. They didn't do very much to try and document what they were buying, and then they were grafting back and forth. And so that a lot of the variety names were lost. But you were talking about the DNA testing. Can we reverse DNA test and recreate those varieties that existed before the grafting?
No, we can't recreate them. We can know a little bit about the parentage, and I'm not enough of a geneticist to know exactly what the DNA testing will tell you other than a name, that it is likely this name. But they do have some parentage. They have to know the parentage to know the name. So no, you can't recreate. Once gone.
So that was a hardball question. Here's a softball question. Beverages aside, what is your favorite apple recipe and what apple do you use in it?
Okay, so that's a great question. People usually ask me what is my favorite apple, which is really softball. And Tom Burford, a great Virginia apple person, used to always say the last one I ate. So I like fried apples. And I think anything starchy, and I think one reason I like fried apples is that you can use even the horrid Granny Smith, because Granny Smith are almost all picked unripe. So if you, next time you get a Granny Smith, cut it open around the equator, open it up, and you'll see the seeds, and I guarantee you they won't be dark brown. Sometimes they're white, which means the apple isn't even physiologically ripe, much less ripe for flavor. But that thing will keep forever. Will absolutely keep forever. And it has some acidity. It has a little sweetness. So you think about when you're cooking and you want to have some goo. You know, I like to always put a Granny Smith in a pie or crumble or crisp. They're good fried because that starch releases and it makes apple goo. You know, it makes that good stuff. And if it's not sweet enough, you just put some sugar on it. Does have a nice sweetness. So fried apples, the Rawls Janet on the cover of my book is a great apple to fry. Anything tart that will hold its shape. You know, people ask what are good for pies, a mixture, and have some that will fall apart and some that will stay together. You know, Golden Delicious will fall apart and Granny Smith will stay together. Okay.
What is an orchard close to Richmond that we could go and a lot of times we don't know what's our favorite apple because we don't have any choices.
Yeah.
And what's one we can go that grows a lot of variety?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. Many are wholesale orchards like Glaze, but one that is open and sells apples is Albemarle Cider Works, just south of Charlottesville. I think they grow a couple hundred different apple varieties. They also have like 30 peach varieties, which would be coming in now. And they used to sell at the farmer's market in Charlottesville. And you might check, Suzanne, are there apple salespeople at the farmer's market here? Have you seen? Yeah. Yellow transparent should be coming in right now. Yeah. So I think we're close to wrapping up. Maybe one more question, okay?
You're talking about a blend of apples for an apple pie. Do you have a special blend that you use when you're making applesauce?
You know, I really like yellow transparent, summer transparent, the same name, same apple. It's an old Southern apple. The newer version would be Lodi, Lodi, and it comes now. It's very mild. It falls apart when you cook it. And I blush to say, don't let Julia know, I make my applesauce in a crock pot. It really makes the best applesauce, and it's really easy. You stick an immersion blender in it. Yeah, very easy. So I turned 70 last year and published a book. But I say that because I know you're curious people and you notice the world around you, and you chose to come here at lunch rather than go to McDonald's or to, watch the ball game or whatever. I believe that, when I was in my 30s, I thought I was like a cake. One day I was going to come out of the oven. I was going to be all done. I was going to get iced, frosting, and then I'd be done. And fortunately, I figured out soon enough that life isn't like that. We're never done. And at age 70, I feel great sense of possibility. And and creative life ahead of me, even at this old age. And I believe we're never done. We're never done learning and growing, learning from events like this, being a better friend, being a better partner. And I encourage you to go out and do that. Thanks for coming today. Oh, and I think they've got a table for me out front, and I'll do a little signing if you want me to inscribe some books or whatever.